just to reiterate, this is something for people that are newer to OMERACT. This development of core outcome sets is something that we've been doing since the beginning, since 1992. And we always focus on first deciding what should be measured across clinical trials, and then deciding how we should be measuring it. And then together those form the core outcome sets. So that's a lot of the work that we see happening at OMERACT. But as Phil was mentioning, there's also this methodology stream that's happening at OMERACT, often behind the scenes, trying to figure out the best ways to approach the instrument selection or the domain selection that we've done. And then every OMERACT, we have a workshop that's dedicated to this methods work. So in the last 2 OMERACTs, you might remember that we had a whole session on domain selection and just the approach that we would use for domain selection. And last OMERACT, we did it for instrument selection. So this OMERACT, we're using the idea of imaging as a methodological tool to sort of say, when we move imaging outcomes through this domain and instrument selection, what's the same and what's unique? And the key message that, the take home you'll leave with today is that there were things for all of OMERACT to learn from the imaging outcomes that we put through this methodology. So in terms of outcomes and core outcome sets, we see this division of core outcome sets into the core domain set and the core outcome measurement set. And in the core domain sets, we often ask people to think about the core areas of manifestations, life impact, death or lifespan, and then societal or resource use, and to organize domains across those different core areas. So the imaging outcomes, the biomarker would be under biomarkers, and that would be falling under this manifestations or / abnormalities as a core area. And then you might remember the core domain, the OMERACT onion, that we developed at our last OMERACT meeting, or the OMERACT meeting before that. And in doing this, we've come to consensus across what domains, what things should be measured in a core outcome set. And we've developed clear definitions for each of those domains. And that becomes important as Matt is going to be speaking, that the domains from this onion and the definitions for those domains become paramount when you're starting to select instruments and move through that. So the second part of our core outcome set is, of course, around doing instruments. And what we've done is we've developed the OMERACT way and the OMERACT Filter 2.1 instrument selection algorithm. And today what we're going to be talking to you about is what happens when we move an imaging outcome instrument through this kind of thing, and what are we learning methodologically about OFISA and the OMERACT way and its fit with these important outcomes. So as I said, the lessons you'll learn today is that it really moving an imaging outcomes, thinking it through for an imaging type of outcome really has improved OMERACT instrument selection for all types of outcomes. We'd like to go through the ways that it has done that today. And it's really shining a light on imaging as an important outcome instrument. And we wanted to acknowledge first Mata, because a lot of this work was in her PhD thesis, and she's put a tremendous amount of thought into that. Also, a chapter by Alexandra Eason, George Tomlinson and Andrea Doria in the textbook on research methods in radiology that was around validity, reliability, and responsiveness, and that was really helpful, and we'll be using some examples from that during the session at OMERACT. And also just working groups that are already engaged in domain and instrument work with imaging outcomes, and we've been knocking on doors and talking to people as we work through some of these methodological questions. So
and to Dorcas, Lara, and Martin, who've each put in a lot of effort.
Yeah, we've had a lot of face-to-face meetings around the world to try to bring this to you. So it's a lot of we meet every week. We meet for at least an hour to discuss this, and there's lots of work that goes on between those meetings. So hopefully you'll see that in some of the work that we're presenting to you. So on that note, can I pass it over to Mata, and she's going to walk you through some of these points.
Thank you.
And just give me a second to flip over to you, Mata, because there's a lot of people on my screen. Whoops, sorry.
So Dorcas will give me the control of the screen, and I just would like to tell you a little more about the presentation I will give to you now. This is the presentation that we have planned to make during the method workshop. And I will go through all the slides. And as you will see, we will have some, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So just I will put, I think that I will use this, and it is this. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, and just up at the top, if you say hide, where it says view everyone, you can, perfect.
It's okay.
I can see it now.
Sorry?
It's very good. Perfect.
Yes, I can see it. Thanks. Keep going.
Okay. So this is the slides that we are planning to present to during the workshop. And as you will see, we will have some learning objectives. I will present to you as we are planning to present to all the OMERACTers. So the presentation, the plenary, has three main objectives. So the learning objective are to reinforce the importance of domain definition as a foundation for instrument selection, what we call the domain match. The second learning objective is to understand the importance of specifying the source of variability which may influence the outcome measurement instrument. And the third objective is to increase the understanding on how FISA should be applied to imaging outcomes. I will present each learning objective and then I will stop at the end, and I hope you will comment or ask a question if you have any. We will start by presenting to the OMERACTers what we mean with imaging. So we'll say that all of you know that imaging encompasses several technologies that produce images to visualize normal pathological tissue, organs, structure, and processes. That imaging is one of the most rapidly evolving fields within medicine, and we have several imaging techniques. I will remind what Dorcas just said, that in the OMERACT framework, imaging is working in the core area of manifestation abnormalities, can be a biomarker, is a biomarker, and this is where the imaging outcome are dealing with. Then we will explain what it is imaging. So imaging is characterized by devices which supply a form of energy. The interaction of this energy with organs, tissue, and cells produce image, so what it is made visible. Each device has a different form of energy. There are different tissue interaction, and we make some examples. So the radiography, the X-ray, how it works, the absorption of calcium in tissue, and then we will make the example of bone, the ultrasound grayscale, the ultrasound Doppler, and the MRI. Then we will go to the idea that imaging not only permits to visualize tissue and organs, but can be used as a measurement instrument, because all the structures and processes that are visualized by imaging can be quantified either by ordinal scale of subjective observer-based judgment, for example, a semi-quantitative way that results in a score that indicating presence of absence in a binary way, or a semi-quantitative estimate of a manifestation, minimal, moderate, severe. Or we can use the physical aspect of imaging, so we can use interval scale of units that assess a physical dimension, for example, the length, the area, the volume, the velocity, or, for example, in the PET MRI, the absorption or the other things. So Then we will try to explain what it is an imaging outcome measurement instrument, because sometimes there is the confusion between the device and the outcome measurement instrument, so that the imaging outcome measurement instrument is not only the imaging device, but it is the results of the application of the imaging technique to measure quantitatively or qualitatively a manifestation of interest that is specified here as the target domain, and a score, qualitative or quantitative, is used to measure this manifestation, and the score is the outcome measurement instrument. And then we will compare imaging outcome measurement instrument to PRO. So we have just defined what it is, the imaging outcome measurement instrument, and the parallel is with the patient-reported outcome. For example, the patient-reported outcome is not just the items or the response option, but it is the results of the application of the questionnaire to measure quantitatively or qualitatively an impact of interest that is specified as the target domain, and the score, qualitative or quantitative, is used to measure this impact, and the score is the outcome measurement instrument. And of course, we will remember that PRO can also be used to measure manifestation like symptoms and signs, and not only impact. So when we will choose an imaging outcome measurement instrument, we will give them an overview. We have defined this in 3 steps. First, to identify what we want to measure, the domain of interest. So how to choose the target domain. Second, to choose the best candidate instruments, so the imaging techniques that provide visualization of the target domain, and the instrument, I mean the score, that properly accounts for source of variability. And the third point is to gather evidence on measurement properties of the selected instrument, meaning that applying OFISA. So the first learning objective is to reinforce the importance of domain definition. So the choice of the target domain requires first a good understanding and a good explicitation of the broad domain or the manifestation of interest. And secondly, to specify the target domain that we want to measure in this broad domain and its measurable components, what we call the elementary components. First, we define the core area. Imaging works in the core area of manifestation abnormalities. Then we choose the domain, the broad domain that we want to measure, for example, inflammation. Then we choose the target domain within this broad domain, for example, synovitis. It is really what we focus on, measuring synovitis. And then we define the domain components, what we can actually measure by our measurement instrument. For example, we define the synovitis elementary components. So the choice of the imaging technique, the how, is to choose the best instruments that matching with the target domain. This requires the verification that the technique that we want to use, for example, ultrasound, detects enough target domain components. And if we look at the domain perspective, what we have just defined, so domain and technique perspective are the same for the core areas. What we want to measure in a domain perspective is the inflammation. So by ultrasound, we want to study the joint inflammation detectable by ultrasound. Then we choose what we focus on, our target domain. We have decided that this is synovitis. And then we want to define the synovitis that is detectable by ultrasound or by, for example, MRI, if you want to use MRI. And then what we can actually measure, the synovitis elementary components, and then if we go to the technique perspective, the ultrasound detected elementary components of synovitis. Then we are in this way that we have to verify that the instruments, the scoring system within the technique, for example, ultrasound, has valid and reliable definitions of the target domain and its elementary components. Again, the core area and the broad domain don't change. The target domain is the synovitis detectable by ultrasound. And what can be measured, the theoretical definition of this should be clearly defined. For example, in the instrument perspective, the theoretical definition of an ultrasound detectable synovitis is the synovial thickening with increased blood flow. And when we go to the domain components, what we really can measure by the technique, so we have what we called the operational definition, so the way in which the technique should be used for detecting the target domain. In that case, by ultrasound, we have what we look for is the hypoechoic synovial hypertrophy with increased Doppler signal within the synovial hypertrophy. So you can see that with this boxes approach, we can define clearly and simply the core area in which we want to apply our instrument. The broad domain of interest, in that case, is the inflammation. The way the target domain among this inflammation, for example, synovitis or tenosynovitis or whatever it is, according to the disease we want to study, and the domain components that we can measure by our instrument. For recapitulating the learning objective 1, we think that the first step for applying an imaging instrument is the correct definition of what we want to measure. So the importance of domain definition for domain match, for being sure that our instrument can measure what it is used to measure. So the imaging outcomes, we think that can help us to see the detail required in the definition of our target domain. So the broad domain is the big domain, the inflammation, followed by the specification of the target domain, for example, synovitis, and the measurable components of the target domain. We can use imaging, but we can use any other instrument for measuring this, because the same process applies to other non-imaging domain. And the boxes approach provides a template for the assessment of content validity, which means the match with the target domain. I would like to stop one moment here and hear some of your comments if you have any. Hello?
Sorry, any comments, anyone, or does it seem straightforward so far?
And just a reminder to unmute yourselves.
Paul, seems straightforward so far. Good summary.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, also for me, Marion, it's clear. Very nice, broad.
And also for me, it's Lena.
Great. Okay. Sounds like that's a go-ahead, Mata, for if you want to continue. Mata, can you just test your sound?
Mara is in shock that there are no comments.
There, now you're
Okay.
back on. You were muted for a second there, Matt.
Perfect. Okay, so once we have defined what we want to measure, so by using the boxes and we have defined the level of detail of the domain for applying the best outcome measurement instruments, we have to understand also, we would like to show the importance of specifying the source of variability which may influence the outcome measurement instrument. Of course, what we want is that our instrument is both valid, meaning that it has to measure the truth, and we can also say accurate, and also reliable, that the discrimination that it is always doing the same results when it is applied in the same way, or precise. So this, by using this schema, we would like to show to the people the importance to have the right instruments, that it is reliable and valid. Sometimes we can have an instrument that is valid, so it is measuring what it is able to measure, however, is not reliable because probably they are too much noisy in the application of these instruments. Sometimes the instrument is very reliable but doesn't capture the truth, so is not valid, and in that case we can say that is biased. Or the worst case, that we have the worst instrument, that it is not valid and not reliable. So the challenges, especially when we are using an imaging outcome measurement instrument, is that what we want to measure is the truth, meaning the signal, meaning the manifestation of interest. Sometimes, however, the variability doesn't come only from the signal, because we would like to have all variability in the signal, but can come also by the noise, which is expressed by the random measurement error, which affects the reliability, or the variability can come from the bias, which is expressed by the systematic measurement error, so the fact that we are not measuring what we have to measure, and this affects the validity of the instrument. So we will show to the OMERACTers how we define the reliability, that it is a definition taken from the Merriam-Webster online dictionary. So how good is the instrument at giving the same results every time it measures the same thing. And we will say that the truth is the signal, and all the variability should be in the signal. The variability due to the disease, we want to be able to measure different aspects of the disease, and we have to take into account all the source of variability which may affect this measure. So the machine parameters, the machine quality, the protocol that we use for acquiring the images, the operator, so the training, but also some patient factors. For example, if it is the obesity or the possibility to do not move the legs or whatever, patient characteristics. Then what can also affect the validity? The validity, as defined by the OMERACT glossary, has the ability to measure what it has to measure. And in that case, it means that it measures something, but probably is not what we really want to measure. And which are the aspects that can make the major bias? To use bias definition of what we want to measure, or want to use biased equipment and biased observers, so not well trained or not well able to acquire the images, for example, for ultrasound. So if we think about this source of variability, we have additional challenges that can be seen as variability sources. For example, the variability in the definitions according to the technique, what we call the theoretical definitions and the operational definition, and the way in which OFISA is applied to imaging instruments, to be sure that we apply OFISA in the right way. For example, if we look at the source of variability that may affect the imaging instrument, we have identified 4 sources. The target domain, for example, we have a wrong definition of the target domain, the imaging technique, the variability linked to the imaging technique, the reader or observer, the variability related to the reader, and the patient or the disease. For example, to do not have difference that can be measured in the disease. Specifically, which are these sources? In the target domain, these are the theoretical operational definition. If we are unable to define this, if we do not have consensual definitions, the imaging technique are the machine parameters and the technical characteristic if we use not adapted machines or if the parameters are not adapted to what we want to measure. For the reader is the acquisition part, the interpretation, and the definition, the theoretical definition of the target domain. And regarding to the patient, the physical characteristic, but also the disease characteristics, if everyone is healthy, for example, or everyone is too sick. These generate error that we have called systematic and random. The random, we have to pay attention when we are making our design for making the reliability study. The systematic, we have always to pay attention before starting our evaluation of the instruments. Which are the solutions? For example, for the target domain, if the problem is related to the theoretical and operational definition, and this is systematic, an example is to have bias definition that they are not able to define what we want to measure, the solution is to repeat the definition, to improve the definition through repeated exercise. For example, Delphi rounds in order to agree on what we want in the way in which we define the target domain. For example, for the imaging techniques, an example of error can be the biased, the incorrect calibration of the machine. So the solution is to be sure that the calibration is made properly and the quality of the equipment is adequate for the purpose. Again, for the reader, for example, the acquisition, that if the protocol is unclear, if there is no training, we have to institute the appropriate training and improve the protocol of reading. And for the patients, for example, the positioning of the patients, we should adapt the procedures and etc. and so on. So the idea is that we will present the main source of variability. We specify which are the main possible variability aspects that can affect the reliability and the validity of our instrument, the type of error. We will make some examples and we will suggest solutions. And as a recap of our learning objective 2 is that we have to pay attention when we are selecting our instruments that the quality of the development process of the instrument is completely clear, and this part should be critically appraised and the source of variability clearly identified when we are choosing our measurement instrument based on imaging. We have to remind that noise can affect the reliability and should be minimized by proper procedures, training, and use of repeated measurements. And also what it is really important is the bias that can affect the validity and should be minimized through use of high quality equipment, proper calibration, better and good definition of the target lesions, and proper training in the application of the instruments. I don't know if you have some question at this point. No comment?
No, no questions, Marion. No
So
questions.
nothing, I don't think there's anything controversial to the listeners, but just making sure an amazing amount of time went into making sure there was consistent terminology throughout and that definitions would not be controversial for anything. I don't think there is much. I actually predicted that there would not be a whole lot of pushback from the community, but I am interested to see if I were right. But I'm not hearing anything from any of the listeners.
No, I think it's you could say it all the content itself is fairly straightforward. It's a nice presentation of, you could say, showing what you could say how it is, but I don't think there's any controversial things into it.
Perfect. So I will move forward.
Well, just, Martin here, just one thing which you may not realize, because the presentation is so smooth, that for future instruments to be developed, this first bullet point, the development process of the instrument and its appraisal, given what we've seen to date, that is something that people will probably experience as being additive to what we've done to date. We're trying to make this, really explicit, and in the next part of the presentation, you'll see what it means when you try to move an instrument through a visa. So I'm glad that everybody says, well, sure, we all know all this. That's good news for us, because, like Phil said, it wasn't so evident right from the start.
And if I could add to that, Martin, also, this is Dorcas, and just saying, when we started thinking about things like measuring physical function with a PRO, how well do we define physical function in all these multiple layers, and think about the sources of variability that go into that. And that's where we think this is just really illuminating how important all these things are that you folks understand for all outcomes that are moving through OMERACT.
Okay, so I will move to the third learning objective, to increase the understanding of the audience on how OFISA should be applied to imaging outcomes. First, our idea is to show them where these two steps fit in the OFISA algorithm. And they fit there. Here. So domain match and instrument calibration, so the level of definition of the target domain and the quality of the development of the instrument with the evaluation of all sorts of variability, fit in the first chevron. It is a match with target domain, and then once these, using OFISA, we can go through all of this. The other aspect will be quite clear. First, the domain match. The domain match cover what we called face validity and content validity. In which way? So how to evaluate the face validity of an instrument? By reviewing the development of the definition of the target domain specific to the imaging technique, what we have called theoretical definition, and to help people in choosing the right instrument, we tell them that this definition should be the results of a systematic literature review and a consensus-based process, face-to-face meeting and Delphi exercise for having the most consensual and adapted theoretical definition. Then the content validity. The content validity in that case is to review the identification and definition of the domain elementary components, what we called operational definitions. And for this, we have told that this should be the results of consensus, including a call for images to illustrate the single components. For example, for ultrasound, we define what it is a synovitis, an ultrasound detected synovitis, using a Delphi exercise. Then, based on the results of systematic literature review, then we define what we can measure by ultrasound. So we define the operational definition through a Delphi exercise, but also by asking the participant to send images that show, that illustrate the single components that can be measured by ultrasound. And then it is important to review the development of the score and to be sure that the score that is proposed is based on consensus and it is validated in its definition on images to illustrate the grading. So the images that correspond to the minimal, to the moderate, and to the severe. Then for the instrument calibration, it should be also clear that it is important to review if sources of bias and noise have been adequately addressed in the definition and the scoring system. So we should find in the literature the documentation of the validity and reliability exercise on static images and where appropriate on video clip, which permit us to assess if there is a consistency between the theoretical and operational definition of the technique detected domain components. And also, if there is in the literature the documentation of the reliability exercise on patients, which permits us to understand and to be sure that some points have been addressed, for example, the influence of the acquisition and the influence of the equipment, the standardization of the acquisition protocol, and the influence of the patient characteristics and the disease spectrum. It is also important that we have the possibility to document the retest reliability under ideal circumstances. So before looking at the studies that apply the instrument in clinical trial or longitudinal study, we should be sure that we can find studies that address this aspect of the development of the instrument. The sources of variability once the scoring system is proposed and the definition of what should be measured. Then another aspect is the feasibility in the OFISA. In that case, what we called applicability. And for the imaging technique, this is probably something that is most challenging for some imaging technique. For example, if the instrument, even if it is perfect, can be applied in research, given cost, time, discomfort, invasiveness, availability, and etc. So one part of our application of OFISA in published study is to see if the instrument that we want to use is also feasible and applicable. Then if we go to the other chevron of OFISA, these are the first two, the third chevron is to look at the application, at the use of this scoring system, the best developed, in clinical trial, what we call the criterion construct validity. So first, the study that are looking at the question, is the instrument replacing a gold standard, what we called the criterion validity, or the detection accuracy, to avoid the word diagnostic accuracy. So the idea is to look at the paper on how the instrument matches with the gold standard that is used for measuring the same target domain. And in that case, the systematic literature review should be focused on accuracy study. If there is no gold standard, then we have to use what we use usually, to evaluate the construct validity, review if the instrument output makes sense compared to other instruments for the same or associated manifestation. And in that case, for the imaging instrument, it is very important to be sure that we are choosing the right construct, because otherwise the imaging technique can always be not well validated if we are not able to choose the right construct for evaluating our instrument. Then there is the discrimination part, which is completely different from the reliability we talked before. In that case, is to be able that the instrument, so the scoring system that we have already verified that it was developed in the right way, is able to discriminate and to detect different changes when it is used in trials or measurement study. So in that case, the focus is on evaluating the ability to detect difference or changes. For example, study on test, retest reliability, or study on longitudinal construct validity in order to evaluate either the sensitivity to change or the responsiveness, and the difference between groups with different level of response, so the clinical trial discrimination, and of course the threshold of meaning, for example, minimal or normality or whatever. And finally, the summary of this plenary, which is to understand the summary of this plenary that is focused on the lessons that we can learn from imaging outcomes. The first is the importance of domain definitions as a foundation for instrument selection, so the importance of domain match. Second, the importance of specifying the sources of variability which may influence the outcome measurement instrument. And lastly, how OFISA can be applied to imaging outcomes to build evidence of instrument performance for trials and observational studies. Do you have any comment?
I wonder, Marta, I might just throw in something that's come from Andrea, who sent an email. She said, and this is a bit of a broader statement, I understand there are simultaneous OMERACT efforts to refine a COSMIN tool for assessing diagnostic accuracy primary studies. It would be important to have alignment between the concepts of imaging outcomes and the items of the systematic review tool. I'm unaware, is there a co-product with COSMIN on assessing diagnostic accuracy studies? Dorcas or Martin, you might know.
So
yes, I have some information on that.
Go ahead,
Dorcas,
Martin.
go ahead.
No, Martin, go ahead. You're more up to date. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm working with Wieneke Mocking of the COSMIN group, and Marta has also been more peripherally involved in this. It's not just the diagnostic accuracy, but I think they're developing a tool
reliability
to assess all other instruments, not only patient-reported outcomes, but to update their whole checklist for performance instruments and instruments of what we would call manifestations, so laboratory measurements and imaging. And so there is alignment in the sense that I'm in contact with both groups, but Cosmin does have a different focus than what we have. So for instance, they can be more or less strict in applying criteria to say, okay, this is acceptable or this is not acceptable, than we have. But we are striving constantly to make sure that no real gaps open up between what Cosmin is doing and what OMERACT is doing. That would be my response.
And at the same time, most of the things that Cosmin is developing were based on this discussion that we are having now. And with Bineke, we have developed a systematic literature review checklist for imaging instruments, we can say, or imaging technique that has been applied now for grappa, for structural damage. So there are a lot of similarities more than difference.
So I think the short answer for Andrea is you are, of the bits that overlie, you are being careful to try and harmonize.
Yeah. Martin will be probably the best bridge between the two parts. I don't know if you have some comments on the on this third part. So we have tried to explicitate the office application to imaging outcomes, and we have focused and we wanted to permit people to focus a little on the first chevron, what it is, the truth one, and to tell them that the true is also made by the correct definition of what we want to measure and the ability to understand the development of an imaging outcomes. So just to remind to the people that when they choose an instrument in the systematic literature review, they have also be sure that the instrument is capable to measure what it has to measure, and the development of this instrument is consensual and it is free of bias and noise.
Well, I think it describes very nicely what you've shown is how it, you could say, how you can do all the validations. I guess that some of the ways could be done slightly differently than what you have explained, but I think it covers it nicely. And you could say now that we're, one of the questions I would have just to make sure that we get there is that this is probably a presentation, you could say, that should be starting of a workshop or something like that, and you could say an interesting part would be what would come after, say in that 1.5 hour.
Sorry, I didn't understand your question.
No, but I think that this, you could say there is a session of, I remember it, 1.5 or 2 hours, something like that. And I'm just wondering what will come after. You could say, is this just a plenary lecture and then we stop, or is there?
Mm-hmm.
No. What's happening?
Then we move.
What Mikkel's asking, what are the breakouts?
Yeah.
Going to be?
Yeah. So
yeah, just because it's 4 minutes to 2. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is that we want people to understand that not every imaging technique can make the same thing, and when we choose an imaging instrument, it's important that we take into account some aspect, but these aspects of validity and reliability are common to all instruments. And then the idea is that we want to fix to the people the idea of these 3 points as a foundation for an instrument selection, and we will use a case study that you can see here of why doesn't move anymore? Just okay. Of hemophilic arthropathy. We will explain to the audience what it is an hemophilic arthropathy. We know that at the moment there are no working group on this, but the hemophilic arthropathy is a very good example because as the same, we can say, pathophysiological manifestation that we can observe in our chronic diseases, and imaging is a very important outcome. So we'll explain what it is, the hemophilic arthropathies that refer to the chronic joint disease, and that the hemarthrosis start very early, so often begins in early childhood, soon after the child starts to walk. Around 50% of the patients with hemophilia will develop a severe arthropathy. Hemarthrosis, the bleeding in the joint, initially cause low-grade inflammation, so synovitis, which predispose to recurrent hemarthrosis and recurrent synovitis. This starts a cycle of chronic synovitis, inflammatory arthritis, and progressive joint surface destruction. We will show the vicious cycle of chronic hemophilic arthropathy with the joint bleed, the synovial inflammation that makes the cartilage destruction and the bone erosion. And we will tell them that all imaging technique at the moment can be used for evaluating the inflammatory part, but also the structural damage part by MRI, ultrasound, and X-rays. And we will go to the breakout preparation in which, by using this case, we will try to permit the people, the participants, to understand the importance of the definition, the importance to look at the source of variability when an imaging instrument is proposed, and to look at the measurement properties that are published in some publication, and to see if the instrument selected can go through the filter of the OFISA algorithm.